Under a blazing midday sun in the heart of the Sahel, Captain Ibrahim Traoré stood before a sea of journalists, foreign and local, satellite cameras trained on him like vultures circling carrion, the air charged with skepticism and latent hostility born of decades of Western clichés about Africa's hopelessness and lack of infrastructure, charges ready to be weaponized against any leader bold enough to challenge the narrative. But Traoré was not there to recite talking points or placate critics. He was there to dismantle misconceptions, one by one, beginning with the perennial myth of Africa as a continent defined by scarcity. With measured confidence, he recounted how Burkina Faso alone held untapped reserves of lithium, manganese, phosphates, and vast arable land, resources that Western corporations had long coveted but largely extracted with minimal benefit to local communities. He spoke of stranger still stories. Villages that had rejected foreign mining ventures on environmental grounds and instead used modest wind turbines and solar arrays to electrify schools and clinics, distributing power locally and keeping profits inside the country. The journalist shifted, unaccustomed to hearing stories of engineering and self-reliance rather than famine and failure. He pressed on, exposing the myth of corruption as a uniquely African affliction, explaining how bureaucracies in Europe and North America had funneled billions through offshore tax havens, financing luxury lifestyles for elites, yet managed to escape scrutiny by exporting the narrative that only poor nations were corrupt. He quoted auditors and economists, names not typically front-page fare in Ouagadougou, to highlight how multinational corporations were engaging in transfer pricing scams that diverted profits from mining in Africa to holding companies in London and Frankfurt. Traoré then pivoted to land ownership, describing how foreign agribusiness projects in neighboring countries had displaced pastoral communities, seized fertile land, and often exported crops for biofuel markets abroad, leaving local children hungry, even as statistics from regional food reserves painted a manipulated picture of impending collapse. He referenced the 2023 UN Food and Agriculture Report, which stated that sub-Saharan Africa had more than sufficient food production capacity, but that logistical failures and policy manipulation were to blame for hunger hotspots, not climate or population crisis. The journalist scribbled, the cameramen adjusted their angles, sensing the gravity shifting. Now Traoré dug deeper, attacking the media's role in perpetuating stereotypes by emphasizing how Western networks refused to invest in investigative reporting into African successes unless tragedy sold better. He noted that the Africa Continental Free Trade Area (AFCFTA), a game-changing agreement uniting 54 nations into a single market of 1.3 billion people, received 15 minutes of global airtime, after a sandstorm in Dubai made the news for half a day, yet would soon represent the world's largest trading bloc by GDP. He stressed how industrial parks from Accra to Kigali were attracting manufacturing investments, albeit often overshadowed in international headlines by sensational stories of coup and chaos. He cited World Bank data showing that factory output and intracontinental trade had grown by over 30% since implementation, yet not a single Western anchor had run a series on recycled or repurposed narratives emerging from African boardrooms. Traoré then recounted his own cabinet meeting earlier that morning, where ministers had discussed plans for a regional pharmaceutical hub capable of producing insulin, antiretrovirals, and vaccines, intended to reduce dependency on imported drugs and empower local researchers. He contrasted that vision with recurring portrayals of Africa as medically helpless, a patient dependent upon foreign charity. He mentioned diplomatic overtures to India and Brazil, forming technology transfer agreements and securing partnerships to equip Burkina labs with cold chain storage systems and patent-free manufacturing rights. We are tired of being a laboratory for aid. We want to be architects of progress, he declared, voice resonant, data and dignity interwoven. Next, he turned to energy and climate, refuting the contention that Africa could only host Western-funded renewable projects under patronizing conditions. Our solar and hydro potential is continental, he said, describing plans for a 100-gigawatt solar corridor stretching from the Senegal River to Lake Chad, with ideas to export renewable power via high-voltage transmission lines. He was unapologetic about rejecting conditional grants that imposed oversight on usage of funds and mandated foreign oversight on operations. He spoke of alliances with Chinese and Middle Eastern investors that offered capital without strings, emphasizing that sovereignty over energy meant sovereignty over development. The expression on the journalists' faces shifted from suspicion to cautious respect. Documents were requested, contact details poured in. He didn't end with economic data. He addressed the cultural narrative too, stating that storytelling, art, film, literature, was just as vital in shaping perceptions. He referenced Burkina film festivals, Mali's music exports, and Nigerian tech startups hiring locally. He recalled meeting a Mali programmer whose AI-driven irrigation tool was securing water for thousands of farms, and one local novelist whose translation rights were sold in Paris, Berlin, Tokyo. Our pens, screens, and code are rewriting Africa, he said. We will not be defined by others' lenses. Social media lit up that evening, not hashtags like #AfricanCrisis, but new ones like #AfricaRises and #OwnYourNarrative. For once, the Western press couldn't ignore the story. Still, Traoré remained vigilant. He warned that predators would adjust. Western powers would recast themselves as benevolent partners eager to share expertise, unless African governments protected intellectual rights and ensured profits stayed home. He called on African leaders to adopt a shared charter for extractive accountability, 70% national ownership, local procurement mandates, environmental protections with community oversight, and revenue reinvestment in education and infrastructure. We are not against partnerships, he said sternly, but we are against exploitation and erasure. That message resonated far beyond Burkina Faso. NGOs, African Union, AFDB, issued statements of solidarity, and Pan-African media outlets replayed the speech in full. Global analysts began to revise their headlines. And though the press conference ended, the narrative war had just begun. Within a week, diplomatic envoys from Brussels, London, Ottawa arrived, not to lecture, but to negotiate. A few Western outlets, previously resistant, ran in-depth series on AfCFTA, African pharmaceutical innovation, and data on energy investments. Even the BBC's Africa editor admitted live on air, "I underestimated the scale of progress, my coverage will change." Traoré's speech had cracked the narrative that had long defined the continent. Whether cynics saw it as savvy media manipulation or visionary leadership, the effect was undeniable. A continent tired of being told its own story by outsiders was taking back the pen. And one man, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, had just shown how powerful rewriting the narrative could be. In the weeks that followed Traoré's landmark speech, a quiet storm began to brew in policy. Circles across Europe and North America. Think tanks scrambled to issue white papers analyzing the implications of the Traoré Doctrine, a phrase coined by The Economist to summarize his unapologetic push for African self-determination in resource ownership, energy, and media representation. Embassies in West Africa sent urgent cables back to their capitals, warning that a new Pan-African assertiveness was taking root, not through rebellion or isolation, but through competence, data, and diplomacy on African terms. Multinational CEOs, many of whom had grown accustomed to opaque deals and rubber stamp permissions in Francophone Africa, suddenly found their contracts under scrutiny. The new wave of African negotiators, many educated at home, fluent in blockchain financing and ESG metrics, were not asking for concessions, they were setting new terms, insisting on value addition, equity stakes, and community reinvestment. Meanwhile, Traoré convened a summit of regional heads of state, not in a five-star European hotel, but in Bobo Dioulasso, a cultural capital deep in Burkina Faso's heartland. The message was clear: progress does not require a foreign stage. The summit avoided bureaucratic pomp. Instead of reading speeches, leaders workshopped actionable frameworks, a shared mineral pricing mechanism to avoid undercutting one another, a joint satellite internet initiative to bypass Western digital monopolies, and a plan to standardize mining safety protocols so that African miners would no longer suffer in silence while global firms reported record profits. For the first time, smaller states like Togo and Guinea-Bissau found themselves with real leverage, not because of military power but because of shared strategy. Traoré's team even invited dissidents and civil society leaders to speak, ensuring the summit wasn't just a club of presidents but a crucible of public accountability. Western media's initial coverage had leaned towards skepticism, questioning whether this was another populist moment that would fade, but gradually, opinion began to shift. Investigative journalists confirmed Traoré's claims about illegal transfer pricing and mining royalties siphoned off through Mauritius and the Netherlands. Public pressure in France and Canada led to parliamentary hearings on the ethics of foreign extractive deals. African diasporas in Berlin, Atlanta, and Brussels organized screenings of Traoré's full speech, followed by panels on policy innovation and youth empowerment. His voice, once framed as a radical outsider, was now part of a global conversation about justice, voice, and narrative. Africa doesn't need a savior, read a viral tweet. It needs a microphone. And Traoré brought the batteries. In Burkina Faso, the effects were even more pronounced. Young entrepreneurs reported renewed confidence, applications for microloans in tech and agriculture soared. Schools introduced new civics curricula centered on sovereignty, trade literacy, and media awareness. Traoré launched a national media fund to promote investigative journalism, offering grants to young reporters covering issues of accountability and rural innovation. Even government critics, once wary of military rule, admitted the transition had substance behind the slogans. While no democracy is perfect, and Traoré's own tenure remained under intense scrutiny, the transparency of policy communication, and the measurable outcomes, kept dissent focused on ideas, not identity. Still, the president knew narrative power alone could not build roads or end hunger. He made sure his administration didn't mistake applause for results. In private briefings, he emphasized timelines, benchmarks, and deliverables: renewable megawatts connected, hectares irrigated, contracts renegotiated. Ministries were audited in real time. A national digital dashboard tracked progress on major initiatives, visible to every citizen with a mobile phone. "We win," he told his team, "not when we trend, but when we deliver." This discipline, paired with the ideological clarity of his public stance, gave Traoré's leadership an edge that even Western critics had to acknowledge. It wasn't without backlash. Certain Western firms began pulling out, claiming policy uncertainty. Some media outlets pivoted to coverage of military tribunals or security crackdowns, attempting to reframe Traoré's movement as authoritarianism in disguise. But by then, the people of Burkina Faso, and many of their neighbors, had developed a more nuanced literacy about foreign spin. Counter-narratives emerged from local journalists, podcasts, and YouTube channels, dissecting every headline, exposing framing tactics, and asking the key question: who benefits from this portrayal? Africa, once described, diagnosed, and distorted by others, was developing its own media immune system. The old model of Africa through foreign lenses was cracking. One pivotal moment came when a youth-led media cooperative in Ouagadougou released a documentary titled The Cost of Silence, revealing how decades of foreign-backed aid projects had left regions dependent and underdeveloped compared to self-managed community initiatives. The documentary was picked up by film festivals in São Paulo, Johannesburg, and New York, earning praise not for its bitterness, but for its balance. It didn't demonize the West, it simply told the whole truth. "Accountability isn't revenge," said one of the producers, "it's repair." Traoré attended the premiere with no entourage, taking notes in the back row, reinforcing his belief that real power lies not in controlling the message but in unleashing truth. By now, even other African presidents were emulating his tone. Senegal's leader gave a speech invoking resource dignity. Tanzania launched a campaign titled, "Our Minerals, Our Future." Ethiopia's government opened its own satellite tech incubator with regional collaboration, breaking free from the World Bank's conservative projections. It wasn't a continent turning inward, it was a continent demanding fair terms for outward engagement. Traoré's name was etched into the discourse, not as a messiah, but as a catalyst. The silent majority of Africans who had long known the truth were finally seeing it validated in public, unapologetically.